You knew this topic would rise up eventually. So here we present to you a brief history of yeast in brewing. Yeast is all around us, floating along air currents through our homes and into our lives. In fact, it was this spontaneous fermentation method of brewing wherein wild yeasts would happen upon a vat of unfermented beer that helped the original beer makers craft their products. Brewers would leave their vats of grains and water out without a lid, and yeast would land in the mixture and start consuming the sugars put off by the grains. From there, many brewers would preserve a small cake of their last batch's yeast-filled grains to help kickstart the fermentation process in the next batch. Just because they didn't have a fancy Latin name for the yeast or understand the biochemical process of fermentation doesn't mean they didn't know how to use it. The Reinheitsgebot, or Bavarian beer purity law of 1516, limited brewers to only 3 ingredients when making beer: water, hops, and barley. Open or spontaneous fermentation or using a yeast cake was the norm. However, this led to a higher incidence of spoilage, and as people started studying fermentation, they knew that there was something magical that led to better beers, but they didn't know what. In 1680, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the first master of using a microscope, wrote a paper detailing the existence of yeast, but he assumed that it was derived from flour. It wasn't until 1857 when Louis Pasteur demonstrated that not only was yeast a living organism, but that fermentation could not occur without yeast actively working. That yeast, which was used in baking bread as well as fermenting beer, was called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or ale yeast. From there, it took another 25 years before Emil Hansen, a chemist working at Carlsberg, was able to isolate and clone the yeast that they were using in the production of Carlsberg beer. This yeast was initially called Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, but is now most commonly known as Saccharomyces pastorianus and is abbreviated to just be called lager yeast. Once investigation into specific strains of yeast began, it was hard to slow them down. For example, about a quarter of the top fermenting yeasts used in Belgian lambic and Trappist beers are a hybrid between ale yeast and Saccharomyces kidriazebi, and sometimes include Brettanomyces lambicus. Some bread or sour-style beers use Brettanomyces buxalensis, and a Saccharomyces cerevisiae variety diastaticus strain may be used to make a saison. There are over 400 different yeast strains currently marketed on the production of beer around the world, with each imparting distinctly subtle and not so subtle flavors. This is part of the reason why there's so much variety in brewing. With over 400 yeasts, over 80 commercial beer hops, 2 different malts with dozens of different roast profiles, and an uncountable number of adjuncts to add to beer, it's no surprise beer is a lifetime pursuit, both for the brewers and for consumers.